Our next speaker is Professor Ethan Daniel Kaplan. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Liebman and members of the board for allowing me to speak. I'm here to speak in favor of the proposal. And first, though, I would like to respond to a question that Member Hayes raised, which I think is a good question. He raised the question of whether or not it was important that people had the right to know who was in the unit before they voted. And I think with any type of rulemaking, there are trade-offs, and in an ideal world, it would be great to know who all the members of the board, members of the unit would be before casting a ballot. However, though I think there are substantial trade-offs, which I'm going to address in a minute, I think that when you're dealing with 20% of the unit, that for the people, for most people who aren't being contested, it won't matter that much. I think where it will matter more is for the 20% who are under contestation. But precisely for those members, their ballots will only count if they end up being members of the unit. And therefore, I don't think they'll have as much uncertainty in terms of the impact of their casted ballot as you might think. So now on to my comments. Basically, I'd like to talk a little about empirical research on the impact of streamlining, expediting union election processes. And this research is not my own. I have some research that is related to the efficiency of production during union elections, which if I have time, I will address. And if not, I will submit in writing. So there's a decent body of literature, mostly in the Industrial and Labor Relations Review, I'm an economist, and in Industrial Relations, 2 journals, that do address this question. And most of the work that has been done on Canada, because Canada, one, has a very similar system to the United States. It is decentralized to the provincial level, but they do have a somewhat similar system. And second of all, they actually have experimented in changing rules exactly, not exactly similar to this rule, but it's similar in terms of having an expedited process or not. And the experience of in Canada suggests that that a rule-making change like this would benefit unions, but it would benefit unions primarily through the reduction in unfair labor practices filed. So what the evidence seems to suggest is that that when Canada switched, in particular British Columbia, switched from a system where they had a suggested guideline on the number of days before hearing to a mandate, that there was an increase in union wins, that there was also an increase in percentage of filings that turned into elections. And since something like 30%, I believe, of filings never actually eventually get withdrawn, that is a large percentage of potential elections. And that most of the difference is highly correlated with whether or not unfair labor practices were filed. And also, unfair labor practices being filed seems to be very predictive when there's a longer time horizon of whether or not elections come to fruition and whether or not unions succeed. So if it were the case that there would just be a reduction in there would be an increase in union wins because employers wouldn't have the ability to make their case, then I think that this would be at least a more questionable rule. But it seems that the empirical evidence suggests that, in fact, the reduction is mostly through firms using tactics that the board itself oftentimes deems to be unfair, and that those end up having impacts on whether elections get filings get withdrawn and whether or not unions win. So I think the board has a difficult task in balancing workers' rights with firms' rights to represent themselves. But I think the current rule is very sensible, and I think it goes a certain amount of the way towards adjusting the huge differential between the 7% unionization rate and the very high percentages, oftentimes more than 50% percentages that you see in polls of people who say that they wish to be in a union.
Have questions? I don't think you started off by telling us your association, or who are you?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
So I'm a visiting professor currently at Columbia University, but I'm moving into the area as of the fall. I'm going to be a professor at the University of Maryland, College Park in the economics department.
And are you studying these issues yourself, doing empirical
So
research?
actually, the empirical research that I didn't have time to talk about, but that I will try to expedite and submit before the August 22nd deadline, deals more with the impact on efficiency of production of prolonged election proceedings. So there's been some body of work in economics that has looked at disruptive impacts on product quality. For instance, the Firestone tire withdrawal, it turns out, was very related to labor relations disruptions. So I'm actually looking at nurse unions in California. And so far what we're finding is that in the period leading up to a union election, there's a decline in quality of nurse service provision, measured in a bunch of different ways, like urinary tract infection rates, falling rates, things like that. In specific, what we have not done, but which I would like to do in light of this, rule-making contemplation, is to look at how the length of the time from the filing to the election relates to the severity of the decline and also the length of the decline. But what we do find is that after the elections occur, there is recovery in the quality of service provision.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your being here today.